How's it going, folks? Welcome back to part 2 of my ongoing alternate history series, What If Manchukuo Survived? If you haven't already, I recommend watching part 1 first, as that video is vital to understanding this one. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into it. Alarmed by the creation of Manchukuo, a movement for war against the Japanese, spearheaded by the Chinese Communist Party, begins to emerge in China in early 1933. The Communists are motivated to advocate for war, knowing that in a conflict against Japan, Chiang Kai-shek's government would be left with the brunt of the fighting, weakening him severely and allowing the Communists to grow stronger, paving the way for an eventual Communist takeover of China. In our timeline, in 1936, a political crisis known as the Xi'an Incident occurred, which shook China to its very core. As the threat of a Japanese invasion loomed over China, Chinese communists and pro-war nationalists, led by Zhang Zhueliang and the communist leadership, banded together and kidnapped the leader of China, Chiang Kai-shek. The reason they did this was to force him to cease the military conflict against the Chinese communists and form a united front with them to resist Japan. Initially, many communists also called for Jiang to be put to death for crimes against the revolution. But despite these sentiments among the rank and file, the Chinese Communist leadership, under pressure from Joseph Stalin, was able to reach an agreement with Jiang, forming the Second United Front with Jiang's forces to stand together against Japan. However, in this alternate timeline, something entirely different occurs. With the central government in Nanjing much weaker than in our timeline, on January 1st, 1934, the Chinese Communists are able to infiltrate Jiang's personal security service and kidnap the president following a banquet in Nanjing. Chiang Kai-shek is chloroformed and covertly transported to the Chinese Soviet Republic, a communist proto-state. Jiang is brought to the capital city of Region in Jiangxi province. As mentioned previously, in our timeline, the plan for kidnapping Chiang Kai-shek was partially developed by Zhang Zhueliang, the son of Zhang Zhuolin. But in this timeline, he is not present in China. Instead, Zhang Zhueliang works under his father in Manchukuo. Without the younger Zhang serving as a voice of moderation, the plan to kidnap Chiang Kai-shek is much more vicious in nature. Instead of attempting to get concessions from him, the more radical communists, led by Mao Zedong, simply decide to put Jiang on trial and execute him, even after Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and some members of the Chinese Communist Party warn against doing so. To quickly interject here, historical opinions on Jiang vary wildly. Actually, scratch that, they vary drastically. However, there is one view that will serve as the bedrock for this what if. Despite all of his flaws and shortcomings, Chiang Kai-shek's stature as the leader of China, as well as his reputation built up nationwide throughout many military campaigns during the warlord era, meant that he was the only figure who could hold the various factions of China together. No other leader at that time, certainly not Mao, had anywhere near the amount of influence as Jiang. Had he been killed, the Chinese war effort against Japan could very well have faltered horrifically as the various factions and warlords in China began fighting amongst themselves once more, this time in the midst of a Japanese invasion. Instead of reaching a deal with Jiang, on January 10th, 1934, the Chinese Communists, against the orders of Joseph Stalin, put Chiang Kai-shek on trial, find him guilty of crimes against the Chinese Revolution, and kill him, along with any hope of a unified China. The rationale for Jiang's execution is that while alive, he posed the greatest remaining threat to the Chinese Communist movement. The Communists believe his execution would provoke enough chaos to allow them to seize total power and take the fight directly to the Japanese. This was a severe miscalculation on their part. Following the execution of Chiang Kai-shek, China yet again falls into chaos. Jiang's execution sends shockwaves throughout the world, especially in Tokyo, where plans for a full-scale invasion of China are accelerated. After Jiang is executed, the nationalist government in Nanjing begins falling into chaos, instigated by the cascade of infighting within the government regarding the massive security failures that led to the president being kidnapped from his own capital. Further fueling the steady collapse of the government were the various factions of the nationalist government who'd been held together by Jiang's leadership and who were now at each other's throats. Thankfully, before the entire government splinters, General Sun Li-ren of the Republic of China's National Revolutionary Army seizes power within the government and military. Trained in the United States, General Sun secures the support of the Americans in his bid for power, as well as the support of Chiang Kai-shek's widow, Sung Mei-ling. Although his grip on power is fragile, with what power he has, Sun Li-ren orders a punitive expedition to the Chinese Soviet Republic in revenge for Jiang's murder on February 1st, 1934. General Sun's disciplined forces utterly decimate the communists, with the region falling on February 15th, 1934. The communist leadership in the region is all slaughtered, and only one communist leader, Wang Ming, survives, due to the fact that he was not present in the region at the time. Wang Ming, who had recently been engaged in a power struggle with Mao Zedong for control of the Chinese Communist Party, is left by default as the leader of the Chinese Communist movement. Despite the loss of a region, the nationalist government's countless failures over the years had caused the communist movement to spread far beyond the area of influence it had at this point in our timeline. Likewise, with Wang Ming still alive, the Chinese Soviet Republic survives with him. After his victory at Ruijin, Sun Liren's fortunes changed for the worse. With the punitive expedition ending as quickly as it began, Sun and his allies then focused their attention on re-establishing order, but this endeavor is extremely difficult, as the various wings of the party, including the left wing, right wing, and the fascists, have already splintered. While Sun Liren persuades the right wing of the party to unite under him, the left wing rallies under Jiang's old rival Wang Jingwei, and the fascist blue shirt faction of the Chinese nationalists unites under the head of the Chinese secret police, Dai Li. On March 1st, 1934, after last-ditch discussions to form a unity government collapse, an all-out war erupts between the various factions of the former Chinese government. Various warlords who'd sworn fealty to the national government withdraw their support as China fractures once more. Nanjing is thrown into chaos as street fighting begins for control of the capital. Wang Jingwei's faction, being the least militarily powerful, is the first group to withdraw from the capital, moving instead to his old power base of Wuhan and abandoning any effort to militarily contest control of Nanjing. Following this, the Battle of Nanjing is fought between Sun Liren's National Revolutionary Army and Dai Li's army. Although Sun's forces had superior training, Dai Li's ruthless leadership style and charisma had already facilitated alliances with several regional warlords, and when Dai Li's warlord reinforcements arrived, the street fighting began to take a heavy toll on General Sun's elite forces. After weeks of fighting, Sun Liren orders a tactical retreat from Nanjing at the urging of his remaining political allies and the United States, whose advisors have convinced Sun Liren that stabilizing as much of the nation as possible is more important than control of the capital. To rebuild his forces' strength and plan yet another reunification campaign, Sun Liren's forces withdraw from Nanjing on May 3, 1934, leaving Dai Li in control of the capital. Following the Battle of Nanjing, the Republic of China's nationalist ruling party is dissolved into three separate factions. The Reorganized National Government, or RNG for short, a leftist government ruled by Wang Jingwei with its capital in Wuhan. The Republic of China, or ROC for short, a continuation of Chiang Kai-shek's regime ruled by Sun Liren with its capital in Guangzhou. And the Zhanghua Security State, or ZSS, an ultranationalist fascist state opposed to both the Japanese and Westerners alike, headed by Dai Li with its capital in Nanjing. In the aftermath of the capture of Nanjing, Dai Li immediately begins pushing northwards towards Beijing to cement his gains. Opposed to all three of these governments is the Chinese Communist movement, which, although fragmented following the destruction of their capital of Ruijin, is growing larger and stronger every day due to their message of liberation and equality, converting large swaths of the Chinese peasantry to their cause. With all of China's rival governments and warlords focused on fighting each other, the nation is utterly defenseless against outside aggressors as a scramble for China begins between the Soviet Union and Japan. The warlord period, remembered in our timeline as one of the hardest times in modern Chinese history, pales in comparison to the anarchy that had now been unleashed in this alternate timeline. The rest of 1934 proved disastrous for China, as Outer Mongolia, all of Inner Mongolia not currently occupied by Manchukuo, and Xinjiang province were annexed by the Soviet Union on July 1st of that year, transformed into the Mongolian Soviet Socialist Republic and East Turkestan Soviet Socialist Republic respectively. The Soviets framed this aggressive land grab as, quote, saving the proletariat of Mongolia and Xinjiang from the capitalist-induced chaos in China, end quote. Despite the international outcry against Soviet imperialism and outrage amongst the people of China, no country was willing to fight the Soviets over rural Chinese provinces, and none of the current Chinese factions were powerful enough to resist the Soviets individually. A further blow to Chinese sovereignty comes on September 21st, 1934, when, with British backing, Tibet applies for diplomatic recognition in the League of Nations. Tibetan membership is approved later that month, as Chinese diplomatic efforts to prevent recognition of Tibetan sovereignty were frustrated by the fact that there were now three separate governments claiming to be the Chinese government. By the end of 1934, across central China, the Soviet-backed Wang Ming, now unchallenged in his position as the leader of the Chinese Communist Party, had made rapid gains across China's central provinces, aided by direct Soviet intervention, with Red Army forces dressed as Chinese Communist soldiers serving under the command of Wang Ming, as well as Soviet military and political advisors counseling Wang. After numerous catastrophic military defeats fighting against the ZSS and the ROC, as well as numerous promises and assurances made to Wang Jingwei by Wang Ming, on January 10, 1935, the Wang Jingwei-led reorganized national government successfully establishes the Second United Front with Wang Ming's Chinese Soviet Republic. The Second United Front, supported by the Soviet Union, seeks to crush Western and Japanese influence in China, as well as the rival Chinese governments. Following the merger, control of the Second United Front is largely ceded to the Chinese Soviet Republic, with Wang Jingwei's forces and political allies operating under their banner. 1 month after the merger, Wang Jingwei is found unconscious by a groundskeeper at his residence in Wuhan. Although the best medical experts of the Chinese Soviet Republic allegedly attempt to treat him, Wang Jingwei falls into a coma and dies on February 11, 1935. Wang's body is quickly cremated and no autopsy is ever performed. Rumors that Wang Jingwei was poisoned by Wang Ming spread throughout the Chinese Soviet Republic, but no one dares to voice these concerns in public, due to Wang Ming's growing authoritarianism. It is later speculated by many that Wang Jingwei was eliminated to make way for the realization of the ultimate goal held by Wang Ming, the admission of China to the Soviet Union. Soon after Wang's death, the intellectuals and politicians of his faction are quietly purged from the Second United Front, with only the reorganized national government's soldiers and financial assets lasting long enough to be formally absorbed into the Chinese Soviet Republic. However, the rest of China took little notice of the growing power of the Communists, as brutal fighting between the Republic of China and the Zhonghua security state raged across southern and eastern China throughout the rest of 1935. However, one series of events that did get the attention of all of China is what took place in Manchukuo throughout March 1935. Dubbed Bloody March by many observers, in March of 1935, Manchukuo, which had previously continued its economic growth and prosperity unchecked and unaffected by the chaos in the rest of China, began experiencing political upheaval. Since its formal independence from the rest of China in 1930, under the wise leadership of Prime Minister Zhang Zhuolin and Deputy Prime Minister Wang Yongjiang, Manchukuo had successfully weathered the international storm of the Great Depression and the collapse of China. Manchukuo's government had even begun to evolve into an actual institution. The Legislative Council, Manchukuo's unicameral legislature, had, with permission from the Zhang government, actually drafted and passed legislation to better the state of the nation. Furthermore, although it was a de facto one-party state, Manchukuo's sole political party, the Concordia Association, had managed to develop into a real political party, unlike in our timeline, where it was merely a puppet of the Japanese Kuomintang army. This alternate timeline's Concordia Association speaks of the same principles as its real-world counterpart, but this alternate Concordia Association means what it says. The Concordia Association's first party platform, published in 1930, called for Manchukuo to become a nation where the Manchus, Japanese, Han Chinese, Mongols, Russians, and Koreans could live together in peace and pursue the creation of a pan-Asian utopian state. The platform also called for the implementation of government subsidies to grow Manchukuo's industry and agriculture, local councils to grow party membership, and the spreading of their ideas across the country in government-sponsored campaigns. Naturally, the government of Zhang Zhuolin completely ignored all of this, only focusing on the military and the economy, but at the same time, it did not censor or stop the Concordia Association from evolving into a real political party, representing a key moment in the early history of liberty in Manchukuo. And now we return to the Bloody March of 35. Thus far, Zhang Zhuolin and his government had halted the further deployment of the Japanese Kuomintang army, who had relentlessly pressured Zhang to allow them to be stationed beyond the borders of the Kuomintang leased territory, a Japanese colony on the southern tip of Manchukuo's Fengtian province, recently renamed Mukden province. Despite the fear many held of the Kuomintang army, Zhang Zhuolin remained defiant, confident that he was invaluable to the Japanese. Furthermore, Zhang Zhuolin had been running Manchukuo as his own personal kingdom, directly influencing the legislature without accepting any input from his Japanese advisors, much to their anger. Tensions between the Japanese and the Zhang government came to a head in late February 1935, when the Japanese, eager to launch an invasion of China now that the nation was in chaos, presented Zhang with a document known as the Tanaka Memorial, a detailed war plan to conquer all of Asia, using Manchukuo as a base of operations. The two major parts of the plan were the institution of conscripted slave labor for all non-Japanese residents of Manchukuo and the deployment of the Kwantung Army throughout Manchukuo. Zhang is taken aback by the Tanaka Memorial, viewing it as a slap in the face to Manchukuo's sovereignty, a subversion of his power, and a threat to the nation's prosperity. Zhang launches into an angry tirade against General Yamada Otozo, the Japanese ambassador to Manchukuo and supreme commander of the Kwantung Army. In his tirade, Zhang Zuolin angrily rebuffs any attempt by the Japanese to limit his power or enslave his citizens, which he rightfully views as pointless considering the workers in Manchukuo already worked without virtually any rights, and thus the enactment of formalized conscripted labor was a pointless gesture that would only enrage the population for the purpose of perpetuating a Japanese sense of superiority. At the end of the Tanaka Memorial discussions on March 1st, 1935, Zhang Zuolin angrily dismisses his Japanese advisors, orders General Yamada Otozo to depart for the Kwantung Lease territory at once, orders the arrest of any legislative council member viewed as too pro-Japanese, and requests a formal audience with Japanese Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro, convinced that somewhere along the chain of command there had been a severe misunderstanding or mistranslation that had led to the Japanese speaking to him in such a manner. On the night of March 2nd, Zhang Zuolin enjoyed a banquet with his allies and family at his private residence in Xinjing, the capital of Manchukuo. During the banquet, he and his son, Zhang Zhueliang, discussed the events of the day before. Zhang Zhueliang was reportedly very anxious as his father nonchalantly described how he'd handled the matter with General Yamada, and warned his father that the Japanese may now seek to overthrow him, or, even worse, kill him. Deputy Prime Minister Wang Yongjiang later recalled the elder Zhang to have urged calm, telling his son, quote, "I'm far too valuable to the Japanese to be killed. They need me to run Manchukuo. Heaven knows those imbecilic bandits in the Kwantung Army couldn't run this country to save their lives." End quote. These words would come back to haunt Zhang Zuolin soon enough. On the morning of March 4th, 1935, Zhang Zuolin was informed that Japanese Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro had accepted his invitation to meet and that a flight to Tokyo awaited him at Xinjing's Imperial Military Airfield. Confident of his own importance and sensing no danger, Zhang Zuolin boarded a private aircraft and departed for Tokyo at 4:03 p.m. that same day. His plane would never reach its destination. At 7 o'clock, the time it was due to arrive in Tokyo, Zhang Zuolin's plane was reported as missing. A search and rescue mission was mustered in the Sea of Japan soon after. On March 7, 1935, the wreckage from Zhang Zuolin's plane was discovered in the Sea of Japan, with the official verdict being a crash caused by engine failure, with all on board lost. Documents later declassified in the 1960s would show that the plane's engine had been extensively damaged by an on-board explosive device, a fact that was kept secret to all but the highest echelons of the Japanese government. Zhang Zhueliang, Zhang Zuolin's son and designated heir, would never get the chance to grieve for his father. A day earlier, on March 6th, he and his bodyguards had been assassinated in a drive-by shooting by gunmen in an unmarked vehicle while leaving the Xinjing Confucius Temple. Local officials quickly concluded their investigation into Zhang Zhueliang's murder, stating that it was an act of gang-related violence stemming from Zhang Zhueliang's addiction to opium and his unpaid debts. Within the span of a few days, the ruler of Manchukuo and his designated heir were both dead. Documents declassified decades later directly implicated the leadership of the Kwantung Army in the murder of both the elder and younger Zhangs, adding that they had operated with the explicit approval of the Japanese government. Manchukuo was in shock at the loss of the dictator who had ruled over them for 17 years. Although he had ruled with an iron fist, he'd nevertheless presided over a period of peace, stability, and economic prosperity, especially important considering how bad things were in the rest of China. Emperor Puyi proclaimed a month of mourning as the government of Manchukuo began the succession process. Although the Legislative Council and Concordia Association began the transfer of powers to Deputy Prime Minister Wang Yongjiang, the process was halted by the arrival of the Kwantung Army. On March 10, 1935, the Kwantung Army was deployed to Manchukuo despite a prior treaty between the Zhang government and the Japanese that explicitly prohibited this action. The Kwantung Army marched on the capital, Xinjing, led by General Yamada Otozo. Marching on the imperial palace, Yamada's forces were greeted by Emperor Puyi. That same day, in a radio broadcast, Emperor Puyi announced to the nation that he had exercised his rightful imperial prerogative as head of state to invite General Yamada and the forces of the Kwantung Army into Manchukuo in an effort to, quote, preserve the order and prosperity achieved by our late founder, Zhang Zhuolin, end quote. Through a translator, General Yamada states that during the discussions regarding the Tanaka Memorial, contrary to what some rumors had stated, Zhang Zhuolin had actually enthusiastically signed the agreement, giving over much of his power to the Kwantung Army. Furthermore, disgusted by his son's opium addiction, Zhang Zhuolin had also designated whomever the current leader of the Kwantung Army was to be his heir, with this being General Yamada currently. Although all of Yamada's evidence is fabricated, the Legislative Council is unable to contest Yamada's claim to the office of Prime Minister, as the Manchukuo Imperial Armed Forces had already declared themselves to be in the service of Puyi, who had sided with Yamada. Further weakening the chance of the Legislative Council posing any threat to Yamada was the sudden disappearance of Deputy Prime Minister Wang Yongjiang on March 11th. However, unlike Zhang and his son, Wang Yongjiang had not been killed, but instead had fled Manchukuo after being tipped off that an attempt on his life was imminent. Wang Yongjiang had been warned of this by his good friend, Admiral Takagi Sokichi, who'd long acted as a go-between for the Zhang administration and the Japanese government, and was a firm ally of Zhang and the people of Manchukuo. Heeding Takagi's advice, Wang Yongjiang quickly prepared to depart Manchukuo. Even though he'd served a government unrecognized by the world, Wang Yongjiang's role as a skilled technocrat who'd created a prosperous economy in Manchukuo had earned him plenty of fans within other governments, including some within the British Empire. Making successful contact with the British representative office in Xinjiang after discovering his life was in danger, the British agreed to give Wang Yongjiang safe passage on a Hong Kong-bound steamer in the port city of Dalian, located in the Japanese-occupied Kwantung Leased territory. To aid Wang Yongjiang in getting to the port safely, a British spy in Manchukuo, Secret Service Bureau agent Peter Fleming, is assigned as Wang's bodyguard. Fleming and Wang depart Xinjiang for Dalian on March 14, 1935. After a perilous mission that involves constant evasion of Japanese authorities, who were desperately searching for Wang Yongjiang, Agent Fleming is successfully able to bring Wang to safety in Dalian, where he departs for Hong Kong on March 20th, 1935. It would be many years before Wang Yongjiang would return to Manchukuo. With Wang Yongjiang gone and the two Zhangs dead, General Yamada is reluctantly voted in by the Legislative Council as the new Prime Minister and de facto dictator of Manchukuo on March 25, 1935. For his first acts as Prime Minister, Yamada institutes mandatory conscripted labor to be drawn from the population at random, integrates the Manchukuo Imperial Armed Forces and Kwantung Army into one unified command structure, and proclaimed Manchukuo as an inalienable part of the Japanese Empire. Furthermore, General Yamada then assembles a cabinet to aid him in running Manchukuo. All of Zhang Zhuolin's prior cabinet members are dismissed, including Wang Yongjiang, now branded an arch traitor to Manchukuo and declared legally dead. Yamada's new cabinet consists of himself as prime minister, abolishing the position of deputy prime minister and folding the position of minister of defense into the responsibilities of the prime minister, in keeping with the newly militarized structure of the government of Manchukuo. The other cabinet members include Minister of Foreign Affairs Matsuoka Yosuke, Minister of the Interior Aisin Jichiya, Minister of Finance Sun Chichang, Minister of Information Kawashima Yoshiko, Minister of Transportation Yamamoto Jotaro, and Minister of Health Dr. Ishishiro. Ugh. All the members of Manchukuo's new cabinet work with one goal in mind: to squeeze Manchukuo dry of all of its resources for the glory of Japan. Shortly after his installation as Prime Minister, General Yamada begins a national mobilization of Manchukuo citizens and resources for a war against China. This process is greatly accelerated by the fact that the Japanese had already begun a troop buildup in Japanese-occupied Korea and the Kwantung Leased territory. With China busy fighting itself, it would be easy prey. On July 7, 1935, Japan and Manchukuo launched a full-scale invasion of China, sending shockwaves throughout the international world. With China already involved in a bloody civil war, resistance against the Japanese invasion was extremely weak, especially compared to our timeline. On July 11, 1935, the Japanese attacked Beijing, which was then held by Daili's Zhanghua Security State and defended by the Zhanghua Security Army. Although the battle-hardened ZSS soldiers fight valiantly, The defense of Beijing is severely impacted by the recent redeployment of much of the Beijing garrison to Zhejiang province, where the ZSS had been close to seizing the province from Sun Liren's Republic of China. The Zhejiang campaign had been successful, but at the cost of losing Beijing in just 15 days, with the city falling to the Japanese on July 26, 1935. On July 30th, 1935, the Japanese Empire then attacked Shanghai, destroying much of the city as the Zhonghua security state continually rebuffs attempts by the Republic of China to form an alliance. Again, ZSS defenders in Shanghai suffer from severe supply shortages due to Dai Li's fixation on destroying Sun Liren's government in Guangdong. Years later, sources close to Dai Li stated that the reason he refused to aid the Republic of China was that he'd been certain that while Japan might conquer parts of China, it would never be able to fully conquer it. Accordingly, Dai Li focused more on fighting Sun Liren's forces. Historians still speculate what might have been had Dai Li allied with Sun Liren. After a month and a half, on September 15, 1935, the Japanese dislodged the Zhonghua Security Army from Shanghai, in another humiliating defeat as national outrage against Dai Li's mishandling of the war grows. Although many in the Chinese Soviet Republic are eager for war with Japan, on September 16, 1935, Wang Ming shocks his followers by declaring that, for now, so long as Chinese Communist territory is not attacked, they will abstain from fighting Japan, instead working on building their strength for later. With these orders coming directly from Moscow, hoping for the Communists to gain more strength before combating the Japanese. Following the fall of Shanghai, the Japanese Imperial Army marches southwards to continue their conquest of China. On October 3, 1935, the Japanese Imperial Army successfully captures the capital of the Zhonghua security state, Nanjing, after a protracted battle that saw heavy street fighting. Following the loss of Nanjing, the government of the Zhonghua security state was in shambles, but Dai Li himself was unbothered by Japan's success thus far. On October 1st, ZSS forces had successfully taken Guangzhou, the capital of the Republic of China's remnants, after a month-long battle that had eaten up most of the Zhonghua security state's resources. When Guangzhou fell to the ZSS, the Republic of China had fallen into chaos. General Sun Liren, leader of the Republic of China, refused to abandon yet another capital. As the ZSS entered the city, he and his most loyal soldiers engaged in a last stand against the ZSS while holed up in the city's Yueshu district. Although General Sun and his men held out for as long as they could, their efforts were in vain. General Sun fell in the line of duty alongside his men at 2:00 p.m. on October 1st, 1935. Many of the Republic of China's elites had attempted to flee by air, seeking refuge in Hong Kong. However, despite warnings by the British, the ZSS had established a no-fly zone over Guangzhou, with the city surrounded by artillery and anti-aircraft guns. Unfortunately, before the Republic of China had discovered this, many unlucky souls had boarded planes for Hong Kong in the days leading up to the fall of the city, with the vast majority being killed as the planes were shot down. Casualties included most of the remaining civilian lawmakers and officials of the Republic of China, bankers Song Ziwen and Kong Jiangji, as well as all three Song sisters. As a result of these losses, the Republic of China's rump government collapses with the fall of Guangzhou. The only notable survivor of the fall of the Republic is the son of the deceased President Jiang Jingguo. The younger Jiang had left China in 1925 to study in Moscow at a time when relations between the nationalists and the Soviets were warmer. However, following the split between the nationalists and the communists in 1927, Jiang had become a virtual prisoner in the Soviet Union, sent to work in a steel factory after relations broke down between his father's anti-communist government and the Soviets. For 10 long years, Jiang had built a life for himself in the Soviet Union, marrying and starting a family with a Belarusian woman. Following the chaos of 1934 that began the disintegration of the Republic of China, Joseph Stalin had toyed with the idea of allowing Jiang to return to China in a bid to stabilize the nation. By the time the Soviet government had allowed Jiang and his family to go back to China in summer of 1935, it was already too late. Jiang Jingguo had arrived in Guangzhou that September, ready to help improve the situation of General Sun's government, but was confronted with a government already collapsing and an economy in freefall. Quickly recognizing the situation was hopeless, Jiang and his family fled to Hong Kong on September 25, 1935, mere days before the no-fly zone was established by the ZSS. From Hong Kong, the Jiang family traveled through Australia and Hawaii, eventually reaching San Francisco by the year's end, taking up an offer of asylum by the United States government, which viewed Jiang as being a potentially useful future asset. Now victorious, Dai Li and the ZSS Military High Command relocated to Guangzhou on October 3rd, the same day that Nanjing fell to the Japanese. Proclaiming Guangzhou to be their new capital, Dai Li then declared his intention to fight the Japanese for control of China. The ZSS cemented their control of China's southernmost regions with the capture of the island of Hainan a week later. By the end of 1935, the political and security situation in China was beyond chaotic. The Soviet Union had annexed all of the Mongolian territory not currently occupied by Manchukuo, as well as Xinjiang province and Tuva. The Chinese Soviet Republic controlled Shanxi, Shaanxi, Qinghai, Gansu, and Ningxia provinces. The Zhanghua Security State controlled Yunnan, Guizhou, Guangxi, Guangdong, Hunan, Fujian, Zhejiang, Jiangxi, Sichuan, Hainan Island, and Hubei. The Japanese Empire controlled Manchuria, Taiwan, Hebei, Beijing, Tianjin, Shandong, Jiangsu, Henan, and Anhui, and eastern Inner Mongolia. The remaining unclaimed provinces each enjoyed some measure of independence, but most began to feel the pressure to throw their lot in with one faction or another. 1936 would only bring more strife for China. On January 1st, 1936, the leadership of the Chinese Soviet Republic voted unanimously to join the Soviet Union. The territories under the control of the Chinese Soviet Republic are then admitted to the Soviet Union as the Cathay Soviet Socialist Republic just 4 days later on January 5th. The Soviet Union reassures the world that the annexation is solely for security purposes and is only temporary until the Japanese can be expelled from China. Although the Zhanghua Security State pledges to retake the annexed provinces from the Soviets, they are too busy fighting for survival against the Japanese. By February, the ZSS had lost Zhejiang, Hubei, and much of northern Jiangxi province to the Japanese, as foreign support from the reluctant British and French finally arrived in Guangdong, with much of Europe growing nervous that Japan would soon threaten their colonial interests in Asia if Dai Li's regime collapsed. Although the ZSS fought valiantly, the Japanese were far stronger, and the ZSS had already exhausted itself from fighting the ROC before the war against Japan had even begun. By August 1936, nearly all of southern China had been lost to the Japanese as the ZSS consolidated its power in Guangdong and Guangxi. On November 1st, 1936, the Japanese Empire launched Operation Ichigo, an invasion of Guangdong and Guangxi to vanquish the Zhanghua Security State once and for all. As the Japanese made steady progress across the ZSS's last remaining territories, Dai Li committed all of his forces to resist the Japanese. After a brutal defensive war across Guangdong, the Zhanghua Security State collapsed on November 15, 1936, with Dai Li himself dying by his own hand as Guangzhou fell. Meanwhile, in South Asia, Tibet, which had only recently become recognized as a sovereign nation, was admitted into the British Raj following talks between the Tibetan and British governments. Following Tibet into the British Raj were Nepal, Bhutan, and even Afghanistan as well, eager to gain British protection in an increasingly unstable Asia partitioned between Soviet and Japanese spheres of influence. On December 1st, 1936, the Empire of Japan declared that China had been successfully pacified, and the Second Sino-Japanese War ended just as quickly as it had begun, with Japan now the preeminent power in East Asia, and China partitioned by the Japanese and the Soviet Union. Following their victory, Japan enslaved the surviving populace of the Chinese territories under their rule to harness China's resources for the betterment of the Japanese Empire. Following the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War, all Manchukuo forces, including the Manchukuo Imperial Army and Kwantung Army, are supplanted by Japanese troops from the home islands and armies made up of Chinese collaborators. The Manchukuo forces then returned to the command of General Yamada in Manchukuo. During the war in China, General Yamada had been running Manchukuo as his superiors in Tokyo had seen fit. The quality of life for average citizens had plummeted. Productivity was up, and the limited civilian government represented by the Concordia Association that had existed before Yamada seized power had been suppressed and bent to his will. The Manchukuo of this alternate timeline had fast begun to resemble the Manchukuo of ours, but the difference is that this alternate Manchukuo still had memories of a time when things were better. Slightly better, at least. With China conquered, the Japanese government entered into a debate as to their next step. Although some in the Japanese government wished to end their goals of empire with China, others advocated pushing southward and conquering the West's colonies in Southeast Asia. A third faction, headed by General Yamada, advocated for a different plan. Yamada believed that with their recent success in China, Japan should think even bigger. Yamada advocated for Japan to conquer the Soviet Far East and Soviet-occupied China and Mongolia. Then, once the Soviets had been beaten sufficiently and brought to the negotiating table, Japan should strike southward and annex all of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands into their empire, stretching from Siberia to the East Indies and Pacific Islands. Yamada soon gathers enough support within the Japanese government for his plan, and, in a top secret meeting with the highest echelons of the Japanese military and government, the plan is surprisingly approved. However, Japan will need time before it is ready. The pieces had begun to fall into place, and the world was heading for war. And that's where we'll be leaving things for today. Stay tuned for part 3, coming soon.